holding you accountable for that. So what are we doing today? I mean, we don't have that much time, but we want to give you an introduction. This is an interdisciplinary class between history and psychology. So there are two different introductions to this course. One is from myself, which is about history, and then you have one from psychology, which comes from a very different perspective. And that really makes the nature of this course, in that it's not a history course, it's not a psychology course. It involves all kinds of different disciplines. And it really speaks to the interdisciplinarity that we are seeking here at California State Channel 8. So let me get started then very quickly here. What does a historian have to say about Nazi Germany, and why is it important to remember Nazi Germany? So let me talk about why historians like to focus on these 12 years. 12 years, 3 months, and 19 days, or something like that. I made the last number up. It's a little over 12 years. It's from, we start counting January 1933 is when Hitler becomes chancellor and thereby starts taking over the German institutions. That step is done by about 1934, going into 1935. And of course the regime ends in May of 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Germany, first to the Western Allies, then to the Soviet Union. So these are the 12 years we're talking. Now, some historians like to talk about this particular episode because it points at something that, well, I was still alive doing that, right? The so-called Cold War. Now that is a very distant event because the Cold War, of course, was over in 1990. But this was a legacy, of course, from Nazi Germany. So really up until the 1990s, you could feel the legacy. But if you're looking beyond the 1990s, beyond the Cold War, you can really see a lot currently in the 21st century that is very much connected to Nazi Germany. And here's the important lesson. Don't think of Nazi Germany just as a unique event, as something that can never happen again, because that would be a mistake. There are certain unique patterns. We're going to talk about this. What is unique about Nazi Germany? Not the genocide, but what is unique in the way the Nazis got rid of people, the death camps. That's something that's very unique. But genocide, and Dr. Volkan will actually talk a lot about this, is unfortunately quite common. And even, you know, you just have to turn on the TV, you know, look at examples like Darfur, Rwanda. Genocide is something that is unfortunately ongoing, as it's violence. Something, you know, the Nazi regime is extremely violent. And one of the things that I didn't want to teach this class, come out and say it, you know. It's not my expertise. I study the Pacific. I don't study Nazis. So, and there are not a whole lot of Nazis in the Pacific. There were some, but he convinced me. He said it's good for you. It's psychologically healthy to deal with this. And all right, so you know, he dragged me in there, kicking and screaming, and then I kind of realized that events span out of control. You know, especially lately, and I'm not finger pointing at this country. I'm finger pointing at the world. You know. You could look at Erdogan in Turkey. You could look at what's happening in France, what's happening in England, what's happening in Germany, what is happening in Austria. Unfortunately, there's a lot of these things that people call popularism, whatever that means. You know, popularism is something that is at least partially. We also have to be, as historians, we have to be very careful of making too much of a comparison. Okay? In other words, Erdogan is not the same as Hitler. But there are, of course, points of connecting. Okay. And notice that I have not mentioned Trump. Okay. I'm very sidestepping this, because you know, I don't want to get into much hot water here. So I'm leaving it to countries that people, at least in the United States, feel less passionate about, like Turkey, or you know, Germany, or Austria. So it is to some extent a unique event, and to some extent it's not. One of the things that I've noticed too, and I don't know if you have the same impression, society's gotten ruder. People are rude. And you know, much of this is something that was just brought home to us on Thursday. You know, one of our colleagues made a really rude speech. And there is also a certain climate of everything is permissible now. Everything can be said. You don't have to be respectful of other people, no matter what their background, no matter where they're from. And that's for me also something that points right back at Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was this sort of country that it was okay to be rude. It was okay to be violent. It was okay to you basically take the lid off everything. It's okay to have no moral compass. It's okay to spit somebody in the face. It's okay to kick somebody. You know, so, and this is something again that I'm reminded of. That's why we need to study these 12 years, because there should be an atmosphere of respect between all people. Unfortunately, that seems to be a little out of whack, as we are in 2018 right now. The other thing, it's a new direction in history, is about memory. You might not think memory as being something important, but you are, if you just, again, look at this country at the moment, we are in a moment where the United States of America is trying to reimagine itself. I mean, just think about what has happened to all these memorials from the South. General Lee, you know, a lot of them have been removed. That is part of historical memory. Because is it good to have a Confederacy flag flying over a particular local government? You know, these are tough questions to ask. Is a Confederate flag about racism, or is a Confederate flag about heritage? You know, these are things that historical memory pretty much interrogates. It's always my feeling, and that's my feeling, you don't have to agree with this, that the United States has in the past not done a lot of soul searching. I think that's happening now. I think that's good. To present a counterexample, Germany. We've had to have a lot of soul searching because, let's face it, first half of the 20th century, we were bastards. I wasn't born then, but you know, I realized that, you know, coming from the country and still spotting the passport, it's something that you carry with you. You have to deal with it. So, how do you deal with historical memory? That's heavy. You know, that's something that all of us carry with us, you know, inside of us. Even if you hate history, there might be some people here that hate history, that's fine. But let me tell you, you can't run away from it. It hits you in the face when you open a newspaper, when you talk to a relative, it's there, right? It's something that is right there, full front, right there. You can't run away from it. There's a great quote I got from my grandfather. I'm going to introduce you to him, a Nazi. He said, you can't jump over your own shadow. And that's very true. You know, you can't run away from who you are. You know, it's the same thing, what is it, Winnie the Pooh said that, you know, if you ever wondered, wherever you are, there you are.
Wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah, wherever you go, you know, it's a kind of thing. You take things with you. You can travel halfway around the world, it still doesn't cut your roots, cut your memory. So this is something, of course, that is very important and that we're going to interrogate in this course as well. And much of this, of course, has to do with forgiving and forgetting. I mean, the good thing about Nazi Germany is there's so many memorials about it that forgetting is not an option. But, you know, what about forgiving? Is forgetting forgiving? Is forgiving forgetting? You know, all of these are questions that people are interrogating also in the 21st century. And again, the next point, forging national history out of disastrous event, is something that there's a little bit of pride for me to stepping forward that Germany actually did a good job. It dealt with its past. No matter what some people think about letting in over 1 million Syrians into the country, Germany, and I have a lot of people in my family are saying that was wrong. It comes right out of this notion that Germany did something wrong, and there are people in trouble, and we gotta help them out. And that's something very unique. Also unique because if you compare and contrast, and again I don't want to finger point too much here, but if you compare and contrast Germany with Japan, I think Germany has done a much better job in rethinking, in anchoring, if you like, the Holocaust and other things into the educational system. So you can't just forget about it. While Japan, I mean, just recently there was a major conflict that re-emerged between Korea and Japan about comfort women. You know, Japan is not very good in dealing with the past. As a matter of fact, the Japanese government has tried to intervene here in the United States to basically take some very incriminating evidence out of history textbooks. And that's wrong. The Germans would never do that. But Japan does, because it makes them look bad. And of course, last but not least, there's the legacy of the Holocaust. As I said, that's a big one. So big, in fact, that Dr. Vulcan once proposed to teach an entire course on it. And I said, no. And yeah, because it's an important event, and we'll talk about in several weeks in this class, but that will be difficult, very difficult, at least for me. And part of this, the attraction of this course is this sort of cathartic moment, you know, because I get very emotional. Many of you who have my classes know this, but this class, you know, there comes time where my voice will fail, where a tear will show. So, because remember, I'm talking about my own people. And it is difficult to do that. So, introducing to you my grandparents, or my grandfathers, I should say. My grandmothers are not on here. But notice that both of them are dressed in, you know, one is uniform. If you have taken World War I class, I've shown you other pictures of this particular individual. He's my grandfather from my father's side. And this picture, this man is 45 years old. He's just been drafted to fight on the Western Front in 1944 against the Western Allies. He has fought already in World War I. So this is the second major conflict that he is fighting. He became very disenchanted. He actually, because of this, would desert, again, different stories abound, he would desert in March or April of 1945. He would go home and never ever spoke again about the war. Until he had this really troublesome grandkid by the name of Rainer Bushman, who was constantly complaining and whining. So he went to his closet, took out his bayonet, slammed it on the desk, and he said, you know, Rainer, if you don't keep whining, I want you to look at this bayonet, take it out, and then reflect on what some people really went through, as opposed to you, who were born in 1965 and had nothing to do with it. Shut me up, right? Shut me up. As far as I know, he was also famous, and again, there's a lot of stories that we get, and you have to take these stories with grain of salt. As you know, he's no longer alive, and then these stories kind of become embellished over a generation. But there's the story where he was given leave in February of 1945, and there was a speaker standing on a marketplace. He went back home, a speaker on the marketplace, a diehard Nazi, who was basically saying, we have to hold out until the very end. Don't worry, we're going to turn the tide. The wonder weapons will win this war for us. And my grandfather, having seen the actual front, and having been part of the major withdrawal from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from France, knew that the war was pretty much over, so he took his rifle, went up to the Nazi, and gave him the rifle, and he said, here's your wonder weapon, why don't you go fight? Needless to say, his leave was immediately revoked, and he was back at the front. That was probably a good thing. It's a good thing that he said that in February of 1945 when Germany needed every single soldier. He would have said it earlier, could have been dead. Could have been dead. So that's why he deserted ultimately in March and April of 1945, because he had lost faith in that regime. Now let's move to this other individual. His name, by the way, is Frederick Bushman. This is Alfred Gitter. He's my mother's grandfather. Very different kind of individual, a teacher. He actually was the provost of a very large high school in Germany. Very much involved in the educational system. Never seen a fight in his life. But I don't know if you noticed that little sign, and I forgot to bring it in. I'll bring it in next week, I promise. That is a badge that has a swastika on it. Yeah. My mom didn't want to give me this picture. You can maybe reflect on why. Because this was a picture probably taken a little bit earlier than the other one, probably early 40s. But it's also about a person that's very proud of the Nazis, very proud of what the Nazis did for Germany. He's sometimes characterized as a 150%er, which in Germany means that somebody that goes more Catholic than the Pope. In other words, somebody that goes above and beyond what you have to do for your duty. What can I say about him? A very interesting character. I'm going to leave it there. He actually was a speaker, and a good one. So towards the end of the war, he would give speeches. And sometimes I like to imagine that the rifle that the other grandfather gave maybe to him, because they were both, probably not, odds are against that. But you know, it also shows two very different perspectives on Nazi Germany. Now you can see. I mean, some people who support the regime wholeheartedly, and he certainly is one of them. Again, I don't want you to walk away and hate him, but he was a German nationalist. He suffered because of the Versailles Treaty. He felt that was the worst thing that ever happened to Germany, and he really believed that the Nazis were bringing honor back to Germany, getting the Germans out of their slumber, being proud again about what the country was about. Since he was a prominent speaker and very high up in the local hierarchy, he was actually arrested at the end of the war. Canadians came. He was in the Canadian zone, knocked at the door, and they took every single book with them that had a swastika in them. Turns out that when they interrogated my grandfather, they opened the books, and it turned out most of the books that I had taken were cookbooks that my grandmother had given them. While he was still being interrogated, my grandmother supposedly burned all the other stuff that was a lot more incriminating. Did he know about the Holocaust? I don't know. But I can tell you this. I can tell you that as Germany tried to deal with the legacy of the Nazis, he actually became a Holocaust denier. He entertained Holocaust denying literature, some of which I still have. Because it's an interesting example, because sometimes you just want to know about the arguments. And some of them are really far-fetched. So, does that necessarily mean he knew nothing about the Holocaust? I don't know. Maybe it's a psychological or thing that you don't want to be associated with a regime that you defended that did all of these nasty things. So you want to.
I think what you see a lot of times is minimization.
Okay.
Like, because I talked to you about my dad and the Armenian thing. They see this in my family too. There's a minimizing of it. Oh, it sort of happened, but it really wasn't. It's been blown out of proportion. That kind of thing.
Definitely. So that's basically some of my own, because it's important. Those of you who have taken historiography know this. It's called self-reflexivity. As a historian, you're not an objective being that has nothing to do with the history you teach. But there is a connection. And you have to, as a historian, be very honest about that connection. by saying, yes, I had relatives. Yes, one of my grandfathers fought, and one of my grandfathers was a Nazi. What does that make the rest of my family? I don't know. I can tell you that my mom, to this day, she's 81 years old, will not watch World War II movies. She can't deal with it. One of my favorite episodes, I always like to tell this, because my mom was very shocked by what happened to my dad after the war, and she was 9 years old, and all of this marked her. So when I was brought up, I was never told about the war. I didn't know what the war was. I didn't realize that 2 wars had happened. It was never a conversation topic until I was 6 years old, 6 or 7, and I saw my mom actually watching a movie on TV that had to do with war, and I'm like, Mom, what are you watching? And she said, oh, did you know that we Germans fought 2 wars against the entire world? Wow, did we? And she's like, yes. And I was like, oh. So I remember next day going off to class and being very proud. So I sit next to my best friend in class and I say, did you know that we Germans fought 2 wars against the rest of the world? My friend said to me, he's like, yeah. Did your mom also tell you that we lost both of them? So I went home and I told my mom, I was like, he didn't give me the whole picture. She's like, oh, no, well, just think, we fought the entire world. That counts for something, right? Okay, all right. It's just one of these things. How do you deal with this? And sometimes I'm thinking that losing a war is not a bad thing because it does shake you up. It does shake up the country. And I'm not saying the U.S. should lose the war. Not saying, and there are a lot of more left-leaning historians that said the U.S. has lost a lot of wars, but I'm not going to get into the argument, but sometimes that is a good thing to seek deeper, to soul search. And we in Germany actually came up with a term of what that means when you search deeper. It's called Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Everybody? Very good. One more time. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It basically translates as coping with the past. Okay? That's what it means. Coping with the past. And Germany has done a lot of this. And actually, I should probably correct this. Germany post-1945 did not do Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And this is an interesting thing that I just recently learned. That it wasn't really until the 1960s that West Germany, mostly, because there was a West and East Germany, started coping with the past because it had to. It had to. So it's a very recent phenomenon. Initially, it's interesting, even the Americans who had all the evidence about all the crimes that the Nazis had committed tried to keep that under wraps. Because the Cold War was breaking out, you needed West Germany as a sort of ally. In the 50s, Germany reintroduced general conscription, but you had to go to the army. So the early period, I don't want to say it's whitewashed, but people just didn't want to deal with it. You blocked it out. But after the 1960s, you got a lot of engagement. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a point of national pride of us dealing with this. I mean, national pride, of course, can come from many things. I mean, just think who won the last World Cup. And who will win in 2019? Yes. 5 stars. 5 stars. But again, pride came from many different sources. But sometimes it's good that you engage in the bad, because every country has good and bad. Tell me a country that doesn't. And sometimes we don't like to deal with the bad, because the bad makes us feel guilty, feel shame. But when you deal with the bad, it's also something that makes a country better, more embracing, more open, more empathetic, which is very important, especially in the 21st century. And so, as I talk about Germans here, and I told you this is difficult for me, what you get from me is empathy but not sympathy. Right? And I don't know if you know the difference between the two. If you have sympathy for Germans living under Nazis, if you have sympathy for Nazis, you're probably a neo-Nazi. That means you're so sympathetic with them that you will accept everything they do. Empathy is different. Empathy is what all historians should have. You shouldn't hate the subjects you study. Because if you hate the subjects that you study, if you demonize them too much, then you're not going to have a very straightforward account. It's just going to be condemnation. So empathy is very important. It means understanding and putting yourself in the shoes of someone. And so you get a lot of this. The low-level Nazi official, like my grandfather. The German soldier on the Eastern Front. You're going to get, what does it mean to be bombarded, literally bombarded with propaganda? I have a section on that. So all of this is empathy. Not, and I repeat, not simple. All right, so here's a very good, I love this poem by a German writer. It's called Memory Stones. It talks about the sort of the way of memory. You can read this on your own if you like, so I'm not going to go over this, but memory stones is something that really comes from this sort of notion of prayer stones, stones that you put on a Jewish grave that amasses. But memory stone is something that we all carry, this sort of memory of history, and I think this is prayer stones we must carry forever, no place on earth to deposit. You can't get rid of it. It's always with you. It's something very powerful. And I'll have a lot of, I believe sometimes that poetry, movies, documentaries are important to show in this class too, because if you just give raw numbers, like 6 million Jews killed between 1945 and 1942 and 1945, sometimes that doesn't get to the point of empathy. You just get a number, but not a true account. So you have to move away from straight narratives and present things like poetry. So you get a little bit of that. What does it mean in contemporary Germany to have that sort of legacy of Nazi Germany? The biggest thing, of course, is something that you see currently happening in the European Union. You have the sort of notion that the Germans have lost World War II, but economically they have won the war. That in the 21st century, Germany is using the European Union to kind of colonize the rest of the world. So what you see here, of course, are two examples from Greece, where the Greeks are very upset. Hitler, Merkel, Angela Merkel, I don't know if you know about Angela Merkel. I'm a big fan. I'm usually not a conservative, but it's interesting, what means conservative in Germany would be left-wing Democrat over here. It's just kind of like weird stuff, So Angela Merkel, we call her Angie, right? She is actually a very forward-thinking individual. She has a PhD in physics. She's an extremely smart woman. And she's a woman actually leading a country. Some people say the most powerful woman.
Longest serving.
Longest serving. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. She gets that for the next term. So, but yes, there's something for me that makes me all warm and fuzzy inside. And I didn't put a picture up of Merkel. She's not, not the most beautiful woman in the whole world, but she's a very powerful woman. Most powerful. And sometimes this stuff hurts me, I'm like, okay, I get it, resentment, but she has done a really good job, navigating Germany through this. Of course, that's outside of Germany. What we also have is, much like in this country, much like in any country, is an immigration debate. There is a relatively right-wing organization that formed in Germany about 2013 known as Pegida. I don't know if you heard about this. Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident. Hate that title. But basically these are guys that, go and say that no Islamists should let into the country, they're basically undermining the values of what it means to be German. And German conservatives developed the notion that there's such a thing as Leitkultur, which means guiding culture. There's a guiding culture as to what it means to be Germany. And you know, whenever I hear a debate about that, it makes my hair stand up, right? Because that kind of culture is not something that is static. It moves, and it's good that it moves, right? But a lot of people are trying to box people in. Of course, in 2015, you had what is known as the migrant crisis, and I put the crisis in quotation marks because some people don't see it as a crisis. Actually, some people see it as a blessing. And let me tell you why. Some people would see letting a lot of people into a country as a blessing. Germany is a country that doesn't have a lot of population growth on its own. And this is something that happens to a lot of developed nations where basically population goes down. That also means that you have professions, for instance, that are clamoring for individuals coming in. Especially, this is something that Japan is facing right now, the elderly. Okay, who's going to take care of them? Because if you don't have younger people that take care, and as we are getting older and older and older, how do you deal with that? You know, embracing migrants is one way of doing this. You know, but usually migrants are seen as something bad. Not as something as contributing to society, but as seen as people who embrace radical ideologies, or who are wife beaters, rapists, or criminals. And that is a problem. That's why I'm saying, you know, I put migrant in quotation marks, because that very, very rarely things are contextualized, and they need to be. They need to be. So 1.1 million refugees were let into Germany in 2015, most of them from Syria, but a number also from Iraq, Afghanistan, and a number of countries that were experiencing extreme violence. Of course, things immediately happened, and that's what kind of gave the right wing in Germany a reason to speak out. On December 31st, 2015, a group of immigrants, mostly from North Africa, in Cologne, had congregated near the station and started assaulting women. So this incident was widely publicized. It was felt that the police didn't do enough about it, and that Germany would face more and more crises like this one because of this. So all of a sudden, you saw welcoming signs turning into these in 2015 in Germany. The worst incident that Germany faced was the year after, on December 2016, where a young man from Tunisia drove into something that's very sacred to many Germans. I mean, Christmas is sacred to you as well, but you also have Thanksgiving. We don't have Thanksgiving. So for us, Christmas is like Thanksgiving and Christmas rolled into one. And Christmas markets is something very special. You know, you have mulled wine, you have chocolates, you have all kinds of things. You know, those little, you know, hearts that are made out of cake, great stuff. And somebody's, you know, took a van and just plowed into it. Killed dozens of people. And of course, again, another thing where people are saying, look, this is all what Merkel did. What they overlooked is this, that the man who did the plowing wasn't from Syria. He wasn't from Afghanistan. He wasn't from Iraq. He was from Tunisia. He had just been not given asylum and was really upset about this. This was not an act that had any sort of terroristic. Later on, you would have ISIS, of course, claiming this. But it was something that, again, needs to be contextualized. But most people, of course, used this act and said, look, this is how people from this region, from the Middle East, this is what they are. North Africa, Middle East, this is what they are. And because of that, you get in Germany right now the rise of what could be called a new right. When I say a new right is, we have a right. Angela Merkel is right. Christian Democrat. Right again, Christian Democrat. She's conservative. But she's probably as conservative as Bernie Sanders. You know, but now in Germany, because of all these events, we get a real right, and it calls itself the Alternative for Germany, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland. And initially, this party was a fringe party. We always have neo-Nazis in Germany. Unfortunately, they never go away. The good thing is, for the electoral system, is you have to gain 5% of the popular vote in Germany in order to gain access to parliament. And most of these fringe parties never do that. They don't get 5%. They get maybe 1, 2. Occasionally, especially in the East, they get over 5 and get into parliament, but it's just a few members. But the AfD has emerged as a major force. And I get to how much of a force in a second. So the party basically emerged for saying that Germany is always paying for the Eurozone. So their platform is to pull Germany out of the Euro, reintroduce the Deutschmark, the old currency, the mark that Germany had. And of course they're also saying stop immigration. And this sounds very familiar, right? This sort of discourse. Einwanderung braucht strikte Regeln. Immigration needs strict rules. Yeah, sounds very familiar, right? So, some very interesting, again, figureheads. Frauke, she's right here. Nice, but also very scary. The good thing is that the party almost died in 2016 out of infighting, but then it succeeded on. What is some of the things that to take away from this party? Well, first is that some of the members, and I'm not saying all of them, but some of the members make extreme right-wing statements, extremist statements. For instance, if you know anything about the German soccer team, it's very multicultural. Sami Khedira, Jerome Boateng, just to mention a couple. Jerome Boateng is probably one of the best defenders. He's the best defender, of course, in Germany, but I would also say in the world. His father was from Ghana, his mother was German. So one person from the AfD came out and said, who wants to be the neighbor of Jerome Boateng? Like a real racist statement, right? Saying that I don't want to live next to somebody who's of African descent. Some other name could come to mind, something dealing with S-hole countries, things like that. But basically, what you have here is, and this was a great thing that happened in Germany, and warmed my heart. People would walk in the stadium, would put up these placards and said, Jerome Boateng, please be my neighbor. That was nice. That was a nice reaction from, because soccer fans are usually quite on the right, but in this case they weren't. But what is the problem here? The problem is that as this member made the statement, nobody in the party stood up and said, don't do that. It was tolerated. And so more statements were coming out of people of the AfD, as in saying, oh, haven't we Germans suffered enough? Hasn't the Holocaust been overemphasized? Should we not take that out of the educational system? And again, nobody condemns that. And the other thing, what we see in the AfD is ever since 2016 is a notion of what can only be called, and I put this in quotation mark too, American tactics in elections. Deny everything, just come forward and deny everything. I didn't say that. Name calling, bullying. These are all tactics that sound all too familiar. Right? That's why I'm saying sometimes our culture of civility is fragmenting. So, what does that mean? In September of last year, we had general elections in Germany. Perhaps you don't know much about the political system, so let me just say it. We have a president. There is a German president, but the president is just a figurehead. It doesn't get elected by the people. It doesn't have the same kind of power as your president. So the most powerful person in Germany is the chancellor. That is Angela Merkel. And the way a chancellor gets elected, you can't elect a chancellor, but as a person you can elect a party. And the party will then nominate the chancellor. Okay, and the most powerful party has been for a long time a conservative coalition between the Christian Democrats and, oh, this is my favorite name, the Christian Socialists. They're actually a Bavarian party that doesn't want to be, you know, the Bavarians are always different, right? They think they're different, so they have their own party. But they're basically one. It's only that the Bavarian ones are probably a little bit more conservative than Angela Merkel. So, and in 2013, the Christian Democrats and their sister party in Bavaria had about 41.5% of the vote. So that pretty much means that you can't rule by yourself. You need to make a coalition. What happened in 2013 is that the Christian Democrats actually made a coalition with the second largest party, and get this, it's the Socialist Party of Germany. I mean, imagine having a coalition between Republicans and Democrats, running a country called Germany for about 4 years. It was called the Grand Coalition. Because between the two of them, they had almost 70% of the vote. Well, of course, it didn't feel good, right? You know, there's a lot of differences here, especially when the migrant crisis happened. The socialists wanted more people, especially the Christian socialists in Bavaria said less people, let's cap this. So there were major disagreement already heading into the new election, which was in September of 2007. Election occurred. Notice that both the conservatives and the socialists are losing. Conservatives lose almost 10%, not quite. The socialists have the worst electoral results since 1945. Okay. And they of course blame it because they were part of this grand coalition. But the most scary part of this is the third largest party is the Alternative for Germany. They actually get 12.6% of the vote. They had 0% in 2013 because the party did not exist. And that's, of course, a lot of votes. Of course, immediately, the socialists as well as the conservatives came out and said, we are not going to deal with this party. Okay? We are not going to deal with them. Sorry. So, basically, then what you saw over the last, and I want to emphasize this, over the last 4 months, there's been a struggle to try to create a coalition. First, the conservative tried to create, it's one of my favorite titles, the so-called Jamaica coalition with the Green Party and the Free Liberals. That broke down by December of 2017. So now, actually, there's a major attempt to once again form a grand coalition. I'm not sure that's going to happen because there's a lot of signs that might not happen. What would that mean if the second attempt failed to form a government? New elections, and it would probably mean that the AfD gets even more percentage. And what could happen is that finally, something that already happened, that the AfD will be allowed to be part of the government. Because this happened in Austria just very recently. What does that mean? Well, in 1933 we had a French party. It was a very powerful party. It had a lot of percentage. I'm going to talk about this. Into government, and the rest is history. Right? So, I know I've taken up a lot of time. I still want to give Kevin some time, so I'm just going to skip all of this. There's a new critical edition of Mein Kampf coming out. That's a very important German war experience. Here are a couple of movies that, if you're interested, you can find them on your PowerPoint. I was going to talk a little bit about that, but basically these are German films that deal with World War II. This is one of the more recent ones that deals with coping of the past. It's with a lawyer in the 1960s. It's actually a very interesting history movie trying to come up with primary sources on what is called the Auschwitz trial in 1960. So very, very important. You can watch this on your own. I'm done. Unless you have questions, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Volker.